Imagine waking up after a wild night of partying at the beach only to realize the sand is alive and hungry. What would you do? Because that's exactly what happens in the movie we will be recapping today. It is the 2015 sci-fi horror movie The Sand. A group of friends find themselves trapped and they watch in horror as anything that touches the ground gets devoured. Who will survive this tragedy and how do you escape when the very sand under you wants to eliminate you? Stick around as we dive into the movie. The movie opens late at night on a beach where a large group of college students is having a wild party. As they partied, Mitch tells everyone to place their phones in a bag to prevent anyone from taking inappropriate photos of others. Meanwhile, Vance and Gilbert arrive with a mysterious ball of goo they had found floating in the ocean. Intrigued by its strange texture, they decide to burn it by making the fire bigger, but their plan is quickly forgotten when a heated argument erupts among the group. With the distraction taking over, the ball is abandoned, and the party continues late into the night. The following morning, Kaylee wakes up next to Mitch in the lifeguard stand, feeling an immediate sense of awkwardness as they recall the events of the night before. Nearby, 4 of their friends also wake up inside a car, while Marcia finds herself on a table, sick and throwing up. As Kaylee surveys the area, she notices the beach is creepily empty and littered with abandoned objects, but there were no other people in sight. Soon, she sees a bird that lands on the ground and immediately gets stuck. To her horror, the bird begins sinking into the sand, vanishing moments later beneath the surface. Alarmed by this, Kaylee tries to warn Marcia not to move, but it's too late. Marcia's feet are already stuck on the ground. She struggles to free herself, but the more she moves, the deeper she sinks. Desperate to get free, she reaches out for support, only for her hands to get trapped as well. From the car, their friends initially dismiss her screams as a prank. However, when her terror becomes undeniable, Vance ignores their warnings and leaps out to help. After only a few steps, he too is stuck in the sand. As he begins to sink further, his screams grow more agonizing. Mitch and Jonah prepare to intervene, but the girls tell them that it will be of no use. Vance struggles in pain as the unseen force beneath the sand eats away his skin. In a desperate attempt to save him, Mitch throws a buoy attached to a rope, but it lands too far away. Within moments, Vance's face is nearly gone, and as he lifts his head for one last attempt at escape, thin, thread-like strands emerge from the sand, holding him back down. Helpless, the group watches in horror as both Vance and Marcia disappear without a trace. With 2 of their friends gone, the remaining group scrambles to come up with a plan. Their phones are locked in the trunk, making a call for help impossible. To make matters worse, the car battery is dead, leaving them completely stranded. To check what was really happening, Kaylee cautiously hovers her hand above the sand without making contact. To everyone's shock, thin, hair-like strands emerge, sensing her presence, confirming that whatever is beneath them is alive and hunting. At that moment, Gilbert finally stirs awake, only to realize he has been trapped inside a trash can. Unaware of the horror unfolding around him, he looks round his surroundings and immediately begins shouting insults at his friends for abandoning him. Ignoring their warnings, he struggles to free himself until they mention that 2 people have already died. He immediately stops as he realizes the seriousness of the situation. He tells them that his body is sore from being stuck for so long, but Mitch reminds him that in a few hours, the tide will rise and push him toward them. Meanwhile, Kaylee drags Mitch into the lifeguard stand, while Jonah watches them with jealousy. So, Chanda tells him that he needs to let go because Kaylee was his ex. In the meantime, the mysterious strands creep toward the car tires while Kaylee and Mitch scan through a cooler in the lifeguard stand and find alcohol. With no rescue in sight and the sun intensifying, they start drinking. The people in the car try to shield themselves with a towel. Eventually, Kaylee gathers the courage to ask Mitch about the previous night. He reassures her that nothing happened between them and that they had only talked. Moments later, they find sunscreen in the stand and Mitch gives it to Kaylee, who throws it toward their friends in the car. As the group pieces together their memories, they come to a horrifying realization. The other partygoers never actually left. They were devoured by the sand. Everyone is overcome with emotion except Gilbert, who starts panicking as the heat burns his skin. Then, Jonah throws him the sunscreen and it temporarily eases his distress. Just then, Kaylee notices that the mysterious goo ball from the night is now dried up and split in 2. Ronnie tells them that it looks like something hatched from it. Then, they realize that this wasn't just a strange ball, it was an egg. The creature that had emerged from it is the same entity now consuming people. Since it was only born the previous night, Kaylee speculates that it may not yet be fully grown. To test its reach, she grabs a sausage from the cooler and tosses it onto the sand. Immediately, the strange tendrils lash out and pull it underground. The group repeats the experiment with more sausages, observing how far the creature's reach extends. The tendrils continue emerging, confirming the monster's presence beneath them. With the last sausage, they attempt to identify a safe zone. They find a small area safe from the monster, but it is dangerously far from them. Desperate to escape, Jonah grabs 2 surfboards from the back of the car and throws them onto the sand. The monster does not react for the board, confirming they are safe to step on. He cautiously jumps onto the boards and alternates between them as he begins to move across the sand. Kaylee warns him to keep his fingers away from the ground. Then, Jonah suddenly stops and instead of continuing forward, he turns to the group and insists they need to have a serious conversation. He calls out everyone who cheated the night before. His friends protest that survival should be their priority, but Jonah refuses to let it go. When tension starts to rise, he eventually continues to move. But as he reaches for the bench, the board slips, nearly sending him tumbling, but he manages to grab onto the bench at the last second. Meanwhile, his friends notice the creepy movement of the monster's strands, pulling the boards away. They call out to Jonah, urging him to return, but Jonah insists he can still save himself. Suddenly, the strands surge beneath him, brushing against his stomach. However, he quickly reacts as he makes a desperate leap, landing on top of the table just in time. Meanwhile, the attack leaves bleeding wounds across his tummy and soon, a wave of dizziness washes over him. So, he lays down, trying to regain his senses, and moments later, Jonah snaps out of his daze. He groaned in pain and described it as being stung by 1,000 jellyfish. Though the wounds aren't deep, Ronnie quickly concludes the strands must be poisonous. Determined to find help and safety, Jonah spots a bag on the bench. So, he drags himself toward it and searches through its contents. He finds some food but accidentally drops a banana. To his surprise, it doesn't sink. Curious, he picks it up, then lowers it back down as he realizes that the monster only emerges from the sand while avoiding the bonfire's area. Testing his theory, Jonah jumps off the bench, landing on the fire's remains, and nothing happens. The monster doesn't like fire. Discovering this, Jonah celebrates as he eats the banana. But his wounds begin to ooze pus, sending a wave of horror through him. Kaylee tries to keep him calm and tells him to get back on the table. Reaching for the table, Jonah searches the bag again and he finds some drinks. He begins tossing them to his friends, one by one. But as he throws the last can, the bench cracks beneath him and his wounds tear open and more pus and blood ooze from them. The pain was excruciating as he let out a scream. He grit his teeth and forces himself to move, barely managing to climb back onto the table. Meanwhile, the surfboards continue to shift on their own, dragged away by the monster. Gilbert calls out to the other and asks about their phones. They were in the trunk of the car. So, Ronnie immediately reaches for the trunk, trying to pull up the back seats but they won't budge. She changes plans and attempts to stand on the bumper to open the trunk. Before moving, Ronnie turns to Chanda and tells her to give a letter she had written to her mum in case she doesn't survive. Then, gripping Chanda's hands for support, Ronnie carefully crawls onto the trunk and lowers herself onto the bumper. Meanwhile, Jonah is now unconscious, and Gilbert is barely holding on as the heat drains his strength while the metal can cut into his skin. Ronnie finally manages to fit the keys into the trunk lock. As she lifts the lid, she suddenly slips and nearly falls to the ground. She catches herself just in time and tries again. But as she pulls, the lid snaps against her legs, making her lose balance and land on top of the trunk. The trunk closes once more. Kaylee then observes the width of the trunk and realizes Ronnie will have to lean back to succeed. So, Chanda and Ronnie quickly roll up a towel, hoping to use it as a makeshift rope, but it's still too short for Ronnie to both lean back and open the trunk. That was when Mitch and Kaylee remember the rescue hook inside the lifeguard stand and pass it to Ronnie. However, the movement is dangerous and the car trembles under her weight as the monster's tendrils start piercing the tires, making every second more dangerous. With extreme caution, Ronnie finally manages to unlock the trunk. But just as she reaches for the phones, a blaring car horn shatters the tense silence. The sudden noise startles her, causing her to lose her balance, and the trunk lid slams shut and traps her fingers. She screams in pain while the others frantically wave their arms to the approaching car. The car eventually pulls up near the table where Jonah is, and Officer Alex from Beach Patrol rolls down his window. He casually announced that the beach was closed, but the group hurriedly explained their dire situation. However, Alex dismisses their words, assuming they're just intoxicated. He ignores their desperate warnings and he steps out of his car onto the sand. He walks across the sand and checks on Jonah and Gilbert. However, the creature's strands fail to penetrate his sturdy boots as he moves around. Looking at Gilbert, Alex mocks his size and the ridiculous drawing on his face before attempting to pull him free. The effort proves futile, so he moves on. He tries to release Ronnie's trapped fingers, but that is equally unsuccessful. Growing increasingly irritated, he mocks the group further, telling them that they must be under the influence of illegal substances. Frustrated, Kaylee snaps at him for his incompetence. Alex finally heads to the lifeguard stand and engages in a heated argument with Kaylee and Mish. He orders them to come down and even threatens to use force. When they refuse, he reaches for his pepper spray, only to accidentally drop his car keys. The moment he bends down to retrieve them, the sand shifts and his hand becomes trapped. Kaylee shouts for him to use the pepper spray. So, Alex desperately sprays the creature, causing the strands to retreat underground and release him. But it's too late and the damage is already done. He stares in horror at his arm, which is now partially devoured. The pain is excruciating, and before he can react, the creature pulls him down again. He thrashes and screams, but Ronnie, now within reach of the pepper spray, makes no attempt to save him. She only retrieves the pepper spray as the sand finally swallows him up. Realizing that Alex's boots were impenetrable, Mitch gets an idea. He quickly wears his flip-flops and asks Chanda for her towels, planning to wrap them around his feet as protection. He successfully catches the first towel, but as he reaches for the second, the railing snaps and he falls on the sand. Immediately, the monstrous strands lash out, coiling around him and burrowing into every inch of his exposed skin. The others watch in helpless horror as Mitch is slowly drained of life and his body sinks into the sand. The only remains is a red stain where he had vanished. Moments later, Kaylee notices the monster shifting the broken railing. Acting quickly, she tells Chanda to grab it. She then deliberately breaks more sections, tossing them down along with the towel. But with no other options left, she takes a desperate risk and leaps towards the car. Miraculously, she lands on it and she immediately lashes out at Chanda over her betrayal with Jonah. However, Jonah apologizes to Kaylee, and he tells her that he still loves her. Meanwhile, Gilbert, who is now very weak and battered inside a trash can, musters his remaining strength to reposition himself for better communication with his friends. Unknown to them, the monstrous strands continue creeping toward the scent of fresh blood. The group then turn to help Ronnie as Kaylee and Chanda manage to free her hand before wrapping it tightly with a towel. Then, using pieces of the railings, they create a makeshift bridge across the sand. Chanda cautiously walks across, explaining that she never actually did anything with Jonah. Upon reaching the table safely, Kaylee follows suit to reunite with her boyfriend. Ronnie, the last to cross, hesitates when she notices the blood dripping from her bandaged hand. The distraction costs her as she loses her balance and falls. Acting fast, Kaylee sprays pepper spray to delay the encroaching danger. For a moment, it seems like Ronnie is safe, but as Kaylee grabs her arm to pull her up, the monstrous strands latch onto Ronnie's other limb and drag her down into the sand. The others watch once again in horror as she vanishes into the sand. Realizing they need a new plan, Chanda recalls Mitch's idea and wraps her feet in towels. She sprints toward Alex's car and manages to climb on top. Meanwhile, inside the trash can, Gilbert suddenly feels movement and starts to panic, but the sensation is brief. Just as he reassures himself that the danger has passed, he begins coughing up blood. Then suddenly, enormous tentacles erupt from the can, wrapping around his body and dragging him down, leaving only a gruesome trail of blood behind. Then, the monster turns its focus on Chanda. It violently shakes Alex's car, causing her to fall onto the hood and hit her head, making her unconscious. She eventually regains consciousness later that night, and as she looks around, she spots a raft on top of the car. Taking it, she tosses it onto the sand and makes her way to the table, where she helps Kaylee drag Jonah into the vehicle. As they struggle, the ground starts to shake, sending Kaylee tumbling back onto the raft. Just as she attempts to climb back, a glowing tentacle emerges from the sand and lunges at her. She narrowly dodges, but the tentacle slams the car door shut before disappearing into the darkness. Kaylee scrambles onto the roof of the vehicle as grabs a gas canister. But the tentacle re-emerges and destroys the canister while drenching itself in gasoline. So Kaylee immediately grabs the other canister, dousing the sand around them before striking a match. As the tentacle prepares to strike, she throws the match and ignites the gasoline, which engulfed the creature in flames. As it writhes and screeches in agony, Chanda opens the car door, allowing Kaylee to dive inside. When the monster attempts to pry the door open, the girls fight to keep it shut. Unable to penetrate the vehicle, the beast eventually retreats into the darkness. Finally, there was silence. As they catch their breath, they realize Jonah is dead, and overcome with grief, they both break down in tears. By the next morning, a surfer spots the abandoned car and knocks on the window, waking the girls. Dazed but alive, they step onto the sand as they eventually discover that it was now safe to walk on it. The nightmare is over, or so they think, because deep in the oceans, the massive creature swims toward another shore, in search of its new victims. And that's the story of the movie The Sand, a night of partying that turned into a fight for survival. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more thrilling recap videos, and ring the bell so you never miss an action. Until next time, stay safe, and maybe think twice before crashing on the beach.